Hello, today I'm going to be talking about nonfiction patterns of organization. So, organization is important both in our regular day-to-day lives and in our writing. First, I'm going to give you some examples of some ordinary, real-world examples of organization. So, one example with these folders is just school. If you've ever tried to keep track of 7 or 8 hours of classes and without folders, you know that it can get pretty messy. And just having a different folder for every class makes keeping track of all your assignments a lot easier. The same thing goes with other aspects of life though, such as your laundry. You should probably organize things into light colors and dark colors, or maybe into nice dress clothes, and then towels probably aren't going to go with a nice shirt, probably. So organization matters. Organization is very important in stores. For instance, a lot of times in clothing stores, clothes are organized by size. So if you know that you wear a large, then you go look at the larges and you don't look at the extra smalls. Now, sometimes if you ever shop for clothes at a Goodwill store, those are usually organized by color, which I personally really appreciate because I really like to wear blue and black, and I really don't like to wear purple. So I just avoid the purple section. So that's a matter of things being organized by color. Now, in grocery stores, if you ever go to the cereal aisle, if you've ever worked at a grocery store and stocked the cereal aisle, you know that that's actually kind of torture because there are so many types of cereals. It's often organized so that healthy things are up where adults might see them. And I don't know if you can see this in this picture, but oh look, Cocoa Puffs and Trix are at the bottom. I wonder who's likely to see that. Ah, yes, small children. So that's an example of organization. Now sometimes things can be organized into multiple categories, and that's why I have these black beans over here. You might find, if you're looking for black beans, you might find them with other canned beans, like by the kidney beans and by the green beans, maybe by the chili beans. But you also, if the store has like a Mexican foods aisle or section, you're probably gonna find it there with the tortillas and with nacho cheese and salsa. So different things can be organized into different ways. And that's what we're gonna look at with some of these examples of patterns of organization in nonfiction writing. So one example is a cause and effect organization. Now, I'm recording this in November, it's 2020, and there was just a presidential election. So a lot of what you hear on the news might be explaining the causes of the results of the election. So all these political analysts get on TV and they're like, well, this what the campaign did led to this effect, and the pandemic led to this effect, and the economy led to this effect. They're using a cause and effect structure when they give those analyses. Now, kind of going backwards, a lot of times a campaign will use this cause and effect pattern in the opposite way. So it's more like the cause is if you vote for this person, then this, and this will happen. And maybe you're someone whose candidate doesn't win and you are afraid and you think, oh, this person got elected, this, and this are going to happen. Well, you have just thought with a cause and effect organization pattern. Some words that might help you recognize that cause and effect is being used might be accordingly, as a result, consequently, if this, then something else. So those are some examples. Now, problem and solution is technically a different organization pattern, but really it's the same as cause and effect. It's just less focused on what has already happened and more focused on what you would like to happen. So you might say there's a problem. It might be that the problem is climate change. So maybe you're saying, okay, here's one solution that people could do. here's another solution, here's another solution. Or you could, taking climate change as an example, you could do the reverse. You could say, well, the temperatures are rising globally. And then you'd be like, here's one cause of it, here's another cause, here's another cause. So the same signal words are probably going to be used. It's just that the purpose is slightly different. It's less to explain. I do have a slide up here that talks about author's purpose. So persuade, entertain, inform, and then describe or express thoughts, emotions. So problem and solution is more about persuading, and cause and effect is generally more about informing. So let's go back to another one. So chronological order is a pretty typical, pretty self-explanatory type of organization pattern. Most biographies or autobiographies or history books are written in chronological order. You know, if you read a history of World War II, you'd probably say, you know, Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The Battle of Britain happened in 1940. The United States joined the war in 1941. The war ended in 1945. That's chronological. We've got a timeline. It's typically pretty obvious when chronological is being used because you get words like first, next, after, then. You also get dates like in 1945 or in 2020. So that's that one. Now, sequential is really a variation of chronological, but it's less focused on dates and more focused on steps. So one of the obvious ones is when you have a list of things. It might be how to write an essay. First do this, then do this, then do this. Instructions for something. A recipe in cooking. That is going to use sequential order. First melt the butter, then stir in the eggs, then stir in the sugar, then last bake it at 350 degrees. So that would be sequential. Now, I also have included this writing process graphic. That could be thought of as a process or sequence. And a lot of things that you're going to get in science are sequential order. The water cycle. The thing with this one is that you could start at any point in the cycle. You could start by talking about evaporation, or you could start by talking about precipitation. Whichever case, you're still using a sequential structure. Any kind of how-to essay or assignment would be sequential order. Now we've got compare contrast. I mean, we've got our Venn diagram over here, kind of a fun one that's making fun of the IRS, tax collecting service, and comparing them to pirates and ninjas and zombies. So you see the overlap between those. You've probably filled out quite a few Venn diagrams in your life. So that's just identifying similarities and differences. Sometimes it is not as obvious as this, though. Sometimes it might be talking about two experiences in a person's life and comparing and contrasting those two experiences. It might be comparing and contrasting two types of people. And there's really a lot of overlap between compare and contrast in this classification example that I'm going to talk about next. But compare and contrast, a lot of times you can tell if it's saying one thing these have in common is, or just as this category does it this way, this category does it another way. And then you have your difference words like even though, although, one difference, or in contrast, however, on the other hand. Let's go to classification. Classification, a lot of times would be different from compare contrast because you're putting multiple things into groups and explaining the characteristics of different groups and how these different things fit into those groups. Now, over here, I have a dichotomous key. That's something you might encounter in biology. And so you're grouping these animals, you're grouping them into vertebrate classes. So fur versus no fur, feathers versus no feathers versus feathers, and so on. So that's a way of classifying. If you've think about things you might have done in a guidance class or with a counselor, this is a grouping of different types of careers, different career paths. So that's an example of classification, saying these are investigative careers, or these are artistic careers, and here's why these would fit into this category. Other examples might be if you've ever taken a personality test, like the Myers-Briggs assessment, and you can say, oh, I'm a sensing introvert, which is where I would fall in. That's grouping different characteristics of individuals and making them into a common category. So this is something a person might do if there's really more than two things that are being compared and contrasted. That's kind of where classification structure comes in. It is kind of compare and contrast, but often with more categories. Finally, we've got spatial. So this might be if you're explaining the parts of something or almost taking readers on a tour. So that's why we've got the tour bus analogy. So if you're saying, like, let's say you're describing your hometown or describing the street that you live on. You might say, at the stop sign, this happens. Actually, if you're giving directions, you might be using both how-to or sequential organization and spatial. So again, there's a lot of overlap. Also, another science example, if you're describing a plant cell, you might say, on the outside or surrounding the cell is a cell wall. You might say, near the middle of the cell is the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is the nucleolus. Next to the nucleus, you can find the smooth ER. Throughout the cell, you can find chloroplast and mitochondrion. So those are ways that you might use spatial organization if you're describing something. The final one is order of importance. This is often one that would be used if you were explaining, trying to persuade, or it can be used with other patterns of organization. The one that comes to mind is cause and effect or problem and solution. So you might be making a claim like the Civil War was caused by a variety of factors, and you might start with the most important reason and then explain the smaller reasons. You could go the reverse way, make your claim, start with a small reason, go bigger, and then end with the clincher, like this is the most important thing, finally, in conclusion. This could also be used if you are trying to persuade someone of something, like back to an election example, you should vote for this candidate. Here's the most important reasons, and then additionally. And again, that's kind of still a problem solution or cause and effect structure, but it's just organized so that you, your different reasons are categorized by what's most important. So it depends on, do you want to hook your reader with this big important thing, or do you want to leave them thinking at the end, in conclusion? You want to leave them with this big important thought. So that's really the difference there. All right, so those are just some examples of patterns of organization. There are some others that a writer might use, and they might just use description, which is a bit like spatial, but it might be describing how something felt, like using the 5 senses. And again, there's a lot of overlap between these different types of organization patterns. So as you're reading nonfiction, think about what patterns you're seeing, and then when you write nonfiction, see what you can use, because as we can think of from those grocery store examples, having something organized helps you find something. It helps you navigate through a lot of information, through a lot of details. So being organized can just make things easier and really help you get your point across.